Hello, role-playing people! In this episode of the podcast, I want to recap a more lore and curse-oriented vampire game I ran years ago, sometime in 2015, I think, in the hopes that you will enjoy the story and maybe use the idea in your own games, why not? So this game pretty much works with any setting, though I did use Brașov city as starting location, our hometown, knowing very well that Romania is the old country, it's the land of voivodes and fiends, but they were less present as the game was set pretty close to the coming of Gehenna. A few mentions here. I did intrude on the characters' backstories so that the game would work and the mysteries revealed would be intense and affect the players, but I did so with their approval. I don't think in a standard game I'd interfere too much with the protagonist's backstories, since those are property of the players, shall we say. But they were on board with it, so all is well. The city I presented my players with was a silent war zone, with the mysterious retreat of the Tzimisce elders from the old country. Pretty much all of Romania became this exotic place for vampires of all sects to discover and settle into. So you had Camarilla and Sabbat at each other's throats in the same city. The younger Tzimisce obviously considered this place a holy land of sorts for their clan, history and legacy, and arrived here assisted by their brothers and sisters of the Sabbat. But the Camarilla somehow got wind of this faster, so they settled here before the other sects. You can imagine the Masquerade isn't really a thing, because if Elder Tzimisce were the previous owners of these lands, well, you know what I mean, but it was something that was catching on as these kindred embraced some of the locals and ghouled a few more. Interestingly enough, the Tzimisce elders disappeared with the majority of their servants, ghouls or otherwise, so finding someone to question in regards to these mysterious events was quite the task. Now, the immediate and most visible conflict was Camarilla versus Sabbat, though independents or members of other sects were also in the city doing their own thing, and of course occasionally selling information to the bigger sects in one huge unseen game of chess. Our protagonists were a very interesting bunch. You had a local Nosferatu occultist by the name Condor Kirill, who was embraced at the old age of 70, and had been 70 for a very long time now. Against all odds, Condor was a very humane vampire despite having resided in the old country for so long, and though it wasn't outright stated throughout the chronicle, he might have made contact with the Golconda-seeking Inconnu of Hunedoara Castle. For details on those guys, see the Layer of the Hidden Chronicle book. Next, you had a naive college dropout, Caterina Andronescu, who was a complete airhead but had plenty of friends and was quite lovable. Working as a bartender, she caught the attention of that one Setite who arrived here out of curiosity more than anything else. Of course, as a Setite, his goal was to corrupt everyone and everything using the ritual called Typhon's Brew, which is why he needed this impressionable barmaid. The more she began understanding her new condition, Caterina found herself rejecting the doctrine of Set, becoming more and more rebellious, and as expected, suffering punishment at the hands of her sire time and time again. Her one companion throughout this nightmare was her roommate and childhood friend, whose name was sadly lost to history, but who was a great comfort to Caterina. Last protagonist, the La Sombra Antitribu Andrew Barton, arrived in Brașov at the request of his sire. They were both here to assist the Camarilla settlers, so they were part of the Friends of the Night, offering sound strategic advice and trying to drive out the Sabbat. Now, this needs to be mentioned because it's very silly. The La Sombra Antitribu player was initially going to sit this chronicle out and just spectate, but the way I described a certain character, a certain NPC, really struck his fantasy, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but he joined the game to romance an NPC. Yeah. Luckily, he did play a good character, and hey, while I don't think that should ever be the main reason for joining anyone's vampire game, I myself am a sucker for romance and RPGs, so it's fine. It needs to be said, Katarina's player was completely new to this game, and I ran this campaign considering it a sort of experimental introduction game of sorts, but it is also a Gehenna chronicle of sorts. It's very weird. Luckily, it worked out beautifully. So what happened? What happened was I let my players sandbox around like I always do, spicing things up every now and then, making sure they felt the full weight of the fact that both sects were in the city, and it was a predominantly silent but very active war zone. I let them interact with the NPCs, offering and requesting favors. I threw them in the midst of tense, dangerous situations, whether these were conflicts between powerful NPCs of the same sect, or whether we're talking scouting out the outskirts of the city for Sabbat nests, which of course resulted in some pretty horrific combat. Overall, the game had a little bit of everything, but it was mostly a game of personal horror, self-reflection, and discovery, as the night-to-night activities were centered around personal character development and relationships, or courtly intrigues. So what drew the characters into forming a coterie was the fact that all of them dreamt during their daily torpor, something vampires don't really do unless you count oneiromancy or the nightmares flaw. They dreamt of a dark chamber and this enigmatic figure kneeling before them with a huge smile on their face. Was it a man? Was it a woman? Or anything in between? They couldn't tell, because they themselves were not themselves in this fragmented, recurring dream. The Nosferatu felt like his dream self was something beyond unclean, a being so wicked and disgusting it frightened him to the core. The La Sombra felt like his dream self was the ultimate ruler of all things dark, an entity destined to grab the world by its throat and rule with rein and whip, and it frightened him too. The Setite felt like her dream self was a goddess of most pleasant decadence and sin, the ultimate tempter of living and undead alike, and needless to say, it frightened her too. More frightening still, in their dream, which was revealed in fragments over many sessions, they communally descended upon this mysterious figure knelt before them and proceeded to bleed them dry, eating them alive, and somehow splitting the soul into three and committing communal diablerie. But they were not these monsters they dreamt of. They were the opposite, humane, kind, innocent. They actually did their very best to preserve their humanity throughout the game and formed very deep and meaningful relationships with their retainers, which is always a pleasant thing to see. One night, a new kindred arrived to the city, someone many other kindred considered a mentor in the path of humanity, someone who dedicated their unlife to helping others preserve their humanity. So, without too many thoughts, given the difficulties they were faced with and their inevitable transgressions because of their sire's requests, because of their sects, because of the nightly war between Camarilla and Sabbat, they immediately visited this enlightened kindred in the hopes of getting help and preserving their humanity. While they kept visiting this individual, the war goes on, the politicking goes on, but at some point their havens are ransacked and their retainers vanish without a trace. Condor had a single ghoul he cared for deeply, a kind elderly woman who took care of him and the haven. Despite knowing exactly what he was, she hoped with all her heart that he would find the salvation he sought. Katerina had her roommate, someone who had always been there for her, and Andrew had his own retainer, whose name was also lost to history, but we're talking about a very loyal and competent ghoul, a pride for any Domitor to have, really. So these human figures, who are pretty important to our protagonist's mental comfort, or economical comfort, or physical comfort, go missing without a trace, and their havens are ransacked. They are, of course, forced to find new havens. They are obviously trying to find their missing retainers, and in doing so they end up making deals with clans they really hate, in the hopes that maybe those clans can help them, but no one can. And it's horrifying. As more fragments of the dream are revealed to them, they realize this is no dream. This is a nightmare. And some strange mechanism of fate is binding them together for a purpose unknown. Some of them have abusive sires and suffer regularly at the hands of said sires. They are in a war zone in a land unknown to some of them. They often do things they regret later, things that end up hurting innocent mortals around them, and now their havens are ransacked and their retainers go missing. Our protagonists are not in a good place. In all of this, the one figure who can help them is the mysterious benevolent mentor who encourages them to maintain their humanity and so on. One exercise this mentor insists they all do over weeks is eating food, somehow trying to keep it down for extended periods of time, despite the fact that vampires cannot keep food down unless they have the eat food merit. So, over weeks, he regularly invites them to his haven for dinners and so on. Then their retainers go missing. And if you're not seeing where I'm going with this, no problem, the players didn't see it either. Yes, I pulled a Hannibal on my players. Yes, they ate their own retainers, and this individual left town shortly after the incident. They never caught him, never got to avenge their mortals, and they ended up throwing away even more humanity in the process. Yeah. On the same night it was revealed to them they had eaten pieces of their beloved mortals, they dreamt of diablerizing that strange individual in their recurring dream. Now, at this point, were my players horrified of the game? Yes, and they loved it. I wouldn't have had it any other way. So then their night-to-night activities go on. And shortly after this revelation, Katerina is attacked by her sire. He is sick of her rebellious attitude and decides to simply destroy her and embrace someone else. She fights back to the best of her ability, but it's no use. She is destroyed in her sire's haven. Okay, so secretly I talked to the player and told him to sit out the next session so as to make it look like they really were gone out of the game forever. Now, next session, under different circumstances, I killed off the other two protagonists as well, whether in combat or at the betrayal of someone in their sect. I can imagine what you're thinking, dear listener. Why would I do that to my game and my players? It sounds horrible. Yes, well, I did it because on the following session, a session no one expected but to which everyone was invited, I made it clear to the players that the protagonists somehow emerge unscathed out of the nearest large body of water at midnight on the following night. Obviously, this brought them together even more, as they realized they had just died, final death, no question about it. And they came back. In trying to figure out the rules of what they perceived as an amazing blessing, Katerina took her revenge on her sire, and it was revealed to her that this was not her sire at all, but instead it was her child. The La Sombra player also attacked his own sire, but without the intention of killing them, and managed to beat a confession out of them. None of their sires were their sires, they were instead their childer. So now we're talking about some massive use of dominate here, some massive brain wiping. Who were they? Why were their whole lives fake, induced memories? Why was the truth coming out only now, and why couldn't they die? The protagonists actually suffered a few more final deaths in the following nights, mostly out of their own volition. They just embraced the sun in growing confusion and desperation. And every time they did so, they came back, just like before, but their dreams also intensified, and the experience was atrocious. So they came to realize they had been, at some point, the creatures in their nightmares. They did diablerize an inconceivably powerful elder who just let them do it with a smile on its face. Maybe it was Caine himself. And now they cannot die. As you can imagine, the characters were a mystery to everyone in the city as well. And word of their immortality got out. So everyone knew that these guys die and come back. Everyone hated them. The Camarilla really doesn't tolerate this kind of strangeness. They were considered like a living sign of Gehenna, and they were to be removed. Public enemies number one, blood hunted, and desperately trying to make sense of what's going on. So obviously they ran away, they hid. They lived a life of solitude and hiding. So after a while, they uncovered a cabal of mages who was working on a very ambitious project, converting sunlight into audio format. Can this be done canonically? I have no clue. It seemed very cool at the time, 7 years ago, when I knew nothing about mage, so I just put that into the game. The protagonists actually captured the mage's device and literally held the fates of every vampire in the city in their hands. When the others didn't relent or give in to their demands, our protagonists decided to end everyone. The device was connected to the city's alarms, those, I think they're bomb alarms. So when those went off, everyone, including the protagonists, turned to ash. As expected, they rose again the following night at midnight in a city devoid of any other vampire. No more Camarilla, no more Sabbat, no anarchs, no Inconnu, no anyone, just them. Following nights upon nights of reflection and loneliness, something else came to the city, drawn here by the very destruction they had caused. And when it came, everything froze for one night, as if time itself just ceased flowing. This being manifested itself as 7 identical-looking little girls who spoke in perfect unison, and this being was Malkav. Shortly after, his brother Saulot also joined them. Saulot, who for all intents and purposes seemed to be a normal mortal with a third eye. So what was revealed to them over the course of the next few sessions is that millennia ago, for reasons unknown to them, they had slain and diablerized the one individual who had slain and diablerized Caine. Now, that entity was punished sevenfold, so the characters were again punished sevenfold. To finally find rest, they needed to die 49 times. They had already died plenty of times before. They had no idea how this thing works. They never figured out. And after dozens of deaths, they concluded there is no rest for them. So they traveled the world in search of someone or something who could unburden their souls and their memories. Malkav and Saulot took pity on these Cainites and found a way to permanently remove or alter their memories in such a way that knowledge of their previous existences would not come back. Now, with the approach of Gehenna, everyone's powers are weakening, so yeah, they're beginning to remember everything. Oh man, just thinking about my players' disbelief and excitement every time something new was revealed to them through the course of the chronicle. Oh man, it brings me such joy. This is in no way a canonical story. This is the most fantastic, biblical, over-the-top, brain-wipey Elders game I could think of. It was both an introduction to vampire for one player, and my god, what an introduction it was, and a Gehenna scenario for the other two. And they loved it. Everyone loved it, because this element was the grand finale to what was otherwise a pretty normal and sandboxy game of Vampire the Masquerade, with politics and intrigues and personal horror and the works. So how does the story end? Well, their previous selves, very much in the style of Wraith, their shadows, shall we say, were actually removed from them and trapped inside of Saulot. He believed, after having discovered Golconda, that the only way our protagonists would finally find rest is to face the aspects of themselves that put them in this situation, to face their demons. So in a sort of Golconda-esque Suspire scenario, they sank into torpor and battled their previous selves, their monstrous, inhuman, Diablerist selves. And this was not a physical confrontation. It was a confrontation on many, many levels. Now, Katerina managed to merge with her past self, effectively becoming something akin to a benevolent, humane avatar of a god, of Set. So she became a goddess, ridiculously powerful, and took on the responsibility of reshaping the whole Setite clan into something new. The Nosferatu Condor rejected his past self as a monster, but fully embraced his curse as deserved. That hideousness of the Nosferatu, the fact that he couldn't die. Upon doing so, upon fully accepting his punishment and asking for forgiveness, his torpid body turned to ash, and his soul probably got another chance to live again, a simple, mortal life, rejoining the great wheel of fate. And the La Sombra Andrew, tempted by the promise of power and control over all things, was subdued by his past self and became the very monster he feared and despised. And that is how the game ended. Gehenna probably followed, but oh man, we will always remember this campaign. It went full on lore, biblical myth, mystery, mashup, personal horror, plot twists, various moments of victory for our protagonists, and an end that wasn't to everyone's liking, but overall everyone enjoyed the chronicle, and we will remember it dearly. It was inspired by the Gehenna book, Hannibal, various other things I was reading or watching at the time, so it's not original in any way, but my god, was it awesome. So thank you very much for listening. I do hope you have enjoyed this. Take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.